Fort DeSoto is a coastal defense battery in Tampa Bay, Florida, and is currently a national monument and a public park. It is named after Hernando de Soto, a conquistador for Spain who grew up in poverty and joined the sailors going to South America for fame and fortune. He served in several conflicts in South America, including defeating the Inca Empire, and that's how he got his fame and fortune. Came back to Spain as a hero, used his own funding and some funding from Spain to go back to Cuba and then invade Florida and explore there. He went north and west, and while his exact trek isn't fully agreed upon, they're pretty sure he died on the banks of the Mississippi River. In 1849, Robert E. Lee, among a few others, entered the area to do some looking around to see if they wanted to build a base there. They found that in the current site of Fort DeSoto and the current site of the ruins of Fort Dale, they said those would make good areas for coastal defense. But nothing happened, and then in the 1860s, in the Civil War, there were no fortifications there, but the Union did have troops stationed there to help in the blockade of Tampa Bay Harbor. Now what happens next, I got all this information from a nice old man there who wore sandals with socks on, so that's a pretty trustworthy source right there. I'm going to be doing this a little bit freehand, so it might come out a little bit weird, so just stick with me here. So between the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s and the end of the Spanish-American War in the very early 1900s, there was a lot of change going on in the region. So Cuba was a Spanish colony, and Spain at this point was still a superpower. They had colonies all over the place, but their strength was waning. And in Cuba, they were having a lot of problems because the local populace didn't like the Spanish, controlling them and killing them and all that. Totally understandable. And America, after the Civil War, they started rebuilding the South, doing a lot of that. That included a lot of railroads and stuff. Now, at this point, Tampa Bay was very small. It was a few families with farms who were just, eking out an existence. But they did have a cigar industry going on. So they would ship tobacco from Havana, Cuba, up to Tampa Bay, and then they would roll them up in these factories and then ship them to the rest of the United States. And this was fairly profitable, but really small scale. But then after the Civil War, with all the railroads being built and everything, all of a sudden Tampa Bay had much cheaper and faster access to the rest of the United States. So Tampa Bay, the population grew pretty significantly, and the profits grew as well. So they had about between 5,000 and 10,000 population, mostly Cubans who came from Havana up to Tampa Bay in order to work in these cigar factories and away from the Spanish. They would work there and then send little gifts, some money, stuff like that, back home to Cuba. Now, what these families would do, so it wasn't just one guy sending a care package of a little box back home. It would be 2 or 3 families would pitch together and get a large crate, and they'd fill that crate up with stuff for all 3 of the families that pitched in to ship it. Now, you can send stuff like finished cigars, but, what's the point of that? So they send a lot of, nice fabrics and some other stuff that was made in the United States that was harder to get in Cuba, some money, some food, nice stuff for their families back home. But it's a big crate, so you could also fit, a few rifles in there because they had families fighting the Spanish as well. So those were the undocumented gun shipments. I have seen rumors, although I can't find a good source to confirm it, but I have heard of, on one of the websites, 27 gun running operations sponsored from the United States into Cuba in the 1890s, which made the Spanish start an embargo for American ships going down to Cuba. Now, I'm sure those 27 were the recorded 27 instances, but because ships kept going back and forth between Havana and Tampa Bay, it sounds like a lot more shipments were made of just small, a rifle here, some powder there, just small stuff that kept feeding into Cuba. And, gun running operations in the 1890s, that's pretty cool. So anyway, Tampa Bay became a very important economic site for the United States. The cigars could get shipped out across the country for pretty cheap, and because of the railroad, very reliably, as trains don't tend to sink unless you're that one Japanese train in World War II. But anyway, so Tampa Bay really depended on this cigar industry, and with the Spanish-American War looming, with all these tensions rising, and the Endicott period came around. I'm pronouncing that wrong, but the Endicott period. So that's I've done a few other videos with talking about this with forts in that time period. Fort Armistead up in Baltimore really replaced Fort McHenry for coastal defense, and it was during this period. And originally, Tampa Bay was not included in the Endicott program for more coastal defense batteries. But Tampa Bay and some of the politicians and all that wrote and, hey, we're a major economic source and we have zero defenses. So they included them in there afterwards. And that was the birth of Fort DeSoto and Fort Dale, with Fort DeSoto having eight 12-inch mortars with a range of, let me check in here, 8 12-inch mortars capable of firing a 800 to 1,000 pound shell with 50 pounds of gunpowder for a maximum range of about 7 miles. Now, these guns were really cool. They were made in, I believe it was 1898, and they were top of the line at that time. So they were rifled barrels, breech loaded still. They required 12 men to load them, but they had a electric firing device, and they had safety functions built in, which was pretty rare at the time. There were 2 safety interlocks. The first one prevented firing the gun while the breech was open, which, that's a good thing. And the second one was to prevent the gun from firing when it was less than a 45-degree angle. It's less than that, you're just blowing a hole into the defenses right next to you and killing everybody. Also built, so that was on the battery Laidley, had the 12-inch mortars, and the battery Bigelow was also built, and those were 3-inch rapid-fire Driggs Seabury guns, model 1898. Those are the more typical ones that you think of when you think of, small artillery batteries. Those only had a 4-mile range. They launched a 15-pound shell with 5 pounds of powder. But because of the because of the layout of the Tampa Bay Harbor, it's very narrow in the front with a couple of islands in there. It was very easy to defend. So I'm just talking about Fort DeSoto today. But Fort DeSoto by itself had the range and the firepower to defend the fort, but Fort Dale was built right next to it, and that was actually the origin for it. So Fort DeSoto reported to Fort Dale in the hierarchy. And Fort Dale didn't have any mortars. They just had these, I think it was 3, 6, and 8-inch rapid fire guns. They had smaller ranges than the mortars, but they were faster to fire. Now, Fort DeSoto didn't actually see any combat during the Spanish-American War. In fact, it wasn't even completed until after the war was over. Life on the island was very difficult. This is a report coming from the quartermaster in 1908, and I'm just going to read it in its entirety. The suffering of the men daily at work or drill has been greater than can be imagined by any who have not actually experienced it. There have been nights that the men had no sleep due to mosquitoes in quarters, even though mosquito nets are used. At present, life for the men is a torture both day and night, and the mosquitoes have to be fought with bush continuously, whether at work or resting. The chief surgeon, Department of the Gulf, stated, "If this post is to continue as a station, life for those concerned should be, at least, made bearable." The commander of the Department of the Gulf recommended that the sale of beer and light wines be permitted in the post exchange at Fort DeSoto to add to the contentment and discipline of the garrison. So basically, life on the island was very difficult, and it was completely the mosquitoes' fault. And the chain of command decided, in order to fix this, they would just allow the sale of beer on site. Which, funny, and, that's fair. It's fair. Alright, so after that period, it was manned by a small contingent of people. And in World War I, again, it didn't see any use, but 4 of the 12-inch mortars were shipped to California to be used there, where in California they didn't see any use. Then in 1922, the fort was decommissioned, and we actually have a quote for a good reason. This came from a letter, and this really applies to all the coastal defenses that were built in the Endicott period. And I really like that I was able to find this because it really explains how the times were changing with the technology and stuff. The Endicott period coastal batteries were built because technology had advanced to a point where the defenses that they had already weren't sufficient. So they built all of these batteries. And then most of them, I think all of them, they never saw any use. And 10 to 20 years later, they were all, decommissioned. Technology was advancing so rapidly that in the 10 to 20 years since they were built, they were obsolete. So here's the letter from the Secretary of War. November 23rd, 1922. Modern developments in armament required considerable modifications in our coastal defense plans, and the defense of much of our coastline can now be better accomplished by utilizing mobile artillery instead of fixed armament. The maintenance of Forts Dale and DeSoto is not now essential to the coast defense, and sufficient mobile artillery is available to protect Tampa. The limited personnel for coast artillery purposes, the question of future appropriations, and the damage wrought by the severe storm of October 1921 were also considerations. So that's very cool, because that explains the shift in battle tactics and technology, because these coastal defense forts were built at a time when most ships were still wood-hulled, and those that weren't wood-hulled could still be brought down by a cannon with longer range. But at this point, we're moving on to where a lot of these ships had pretty equal ranges, and we started to see aircraft being used. Now, not so much aircraft carriers yet, that was still a little ways out, but it still meant that a coastal defense was a fixed position, and if the enemy knew where it was, there was a good chance that they could take it out with their armaments. So instead we moved to mobile artillery, so the enemy wouldn't know where the defenses were, and it was a much better deterrent that way. In 1922, the fort was decommissioned. In 1932, a hurricane hit it and destroyed the Bigelow battery, and the sea more or less reclaimed that battery. In 1939, a civilian rented the island for $50, I think it was $50 a month for the first 2 years, and then $100 a month after that. He used his boat, Fort Hobo, to bring tourists to the site, used a couple of the buildings as, little vacation spots, and also rented out the area to fishermen. It was a very successful and profitable venture. But in 1941, the military reclaimed the fort to use as a bombing range. So they would, fly bombers over it and have them drop payloads on the island for aiming purposes. And of note, there was one pilot, a Paul Tibbets, who trained there. And he was notable because later on he would fly the Enola Gay over Japan and drop a very large bomb on them. In 1948, it was again opened up to the public, but this time it wasn't sold or rented out to somebody, it was just open to the public. And it saw quite a bit of tourism. But then in 1962, the toll road was built, and vacationers, the people using it, that population exploded because now it's accessible to everybody. And that more or less brings us up to present day. Florida they get a lot of money from tourism, and so they make sure that any of their tourist sites are very well upkept. So when you look at the differences between some of these like Baltimore forts and sites like that to Florida forts and sites like this, there's a huge difference because Florida gets so much of their money from tourism, they want to make sure that it's good. It's built, it's designed for large groups of people, and so it can actually take those large groups of people. So when I went Fort DeSoto, it was very crowded. There were public beaches and all that, and there were a lot of people there, but it didn't actually detract from the experience. It's a very good fort. It's a very good site. It's a nature preserve. There were animals everywhere. I do recommend visiting. Because of the toll road, you do have to pay to visit. I think it's $1.50. Normally what I would do is find old documents, old maps to show where the buildings were, and then I'll try to show its current form and where the buildings used to be. But because Florida cares so much about their tourism industry, this was actually done before I ever got the chance to do it, which I'm very grateful for. It's in great shape. A mixture of volunteers and Boy Scouts did all this work for me, and they went over, they found the sites, and they put up plaques and rebuilt the supports for the old buildings. So when you go there, you really get a feel for what it was like at the time. Few closing notes before I finish here. Normally what I do, I just make these YouTube videos because I think they're very fun. Don't really have a purpose other than that. But what I do is I go to whatever historical site and I take all these pictures, and then I go home, and after I'm home, then I'll look up, facts about the site and all that. And that screws me sometimes. Fort Armistead, I missed an entire battery because of that. It was reclaimed by the brush, so I didn't see where it was. Fort DeSoto also screwed me here because Fort Dale was its sister fort, and I didn't even know it existed. So I have no pictures of Fort Dale, unfortunately. It requires a boat to go there, so likely even if I knew about its existence, I wouldn't have had anything more than distant shots from Fort DeSoto. Also, the 12-inch mortars, the 4 on site, are the last 4 in existence in the United States of that specific type, and there are 2 others in existence in the Philippines, but that's it. The 2 Armstrong guns on the fort are positioned behind the mortars, which was not the original design, because where they're at now, they wouldn't be able to hit anything that wasn't already inside the harbor. Those 2 guns came from Fort Dale, and those are actually 6-inch guns, while the original Fort DeSoto had 3-inch guns at Battery Bigelow, but that battery was lost to the sea.